If none of you can hit that target, would you dare to let a 79-year-old man try? The question fell across the firing range like a public insult. 3 elite snipers remained prone. Sweat ran down their spines, soaking into their camouflage. More than 20 rounds had already been fired. The target, over 2 kilometers away, still stood there untouched, cold, unmoved. Young Captain Adam Reynolds growled, unable to hide his frustration. This is physically impossible with this platform. Physics won't allow it. No one answered. Behind them, General Henry Caldwell stood with his arms crossed. He asked no further questions. He accepted no excuses. At the edge of the range, an old water cart creaked as it rolled forward. Pushing it was Elias Morrow, the base cook, 79 years old. He stopped, looked toward the distant valley. No hand raised to block the sun. No squinting. He murmured just loud enough for the wind to hear. The wind doesn't run straight. It swirls through the canyon. No one turned around. If you believe that true courage does not live in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Service Honor Stories, so together we may preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our heroes. Elias did not turn around when the shout rang out behind him. He did not apologize, did not explain, did not show the confusion an old man is expected to display when pushed away from a place he does not belong. He simply set the cup of water down slowly on the weathered wooden table, careful enough that the surface did not ripple. His eyes remained fixed on the distant valley, where a tiny target stood, motionless in the vast expanse like a lone mark against a harsh and unforgiving land. His hand trembled only for a very brief moment. Not from fear, not from age. It was an old, familiar reflex, as if a bodily memory had just been awakened. Then the hand stopped, completely still. The dry, slender fingers closed again, steadier than they had been before the tremor. He drew in a slow, deep breath and released it evenly, rhythmically. No one noticed. No one thought a cook would need to control his breathing simply to stand still. A young soldier glanced over and saw him standing there, back slightly bent, apron stained and worn. The glance moved on too quickly to notice how firmly his feet were planted on the gravel. No one noticed that his center of gravity did not waver. No one recognized that he was standing in a posture familiar only to those who have waited a very long time for a moment that decides life or death. "What are you still standing there for, someone?" said the voice, half annoyed, half disdainful. Elias did not answer. He did not need to. He had heard voices like this before, long ago, in circumstances where answers never changed the outcome. He simply lifted the remaining cup of water and placed it neatly beside the others as if this were the only task he had in the world. Every movement was slow, but never clumsy. Slow because there was no need to rush. Slow because he was accustomed to waiting. Wind swept through the canyon, gently stirring the hem of his old shirt. He felt it not with his skin, but with his entire body. One current passed, then shifted. A brief lull. Then another stronger flow followed. His eyes did not narrow, did not search the way people usually do. He simply looked as though reading a familiar line he had memorized long ago. "Not 10 knots," he said, his voice low, nearly blending into the wind. No one asked him to repeat it. No one argued. The sentence drifted away, fell to the ground, and lay there unseen. The silence around him began to thicken. It was not the silence imposed by discipline, but the kind that forms when familiar noise suddenly disappears. The snipers remained prone, their eyes no longer fixed on the target. They looked down at the ground into the empty space before them. A few felt uneasy without knowing why. There was no clear reason. Only the quiet presence of a man who did not speak back unsettled them more than the shouting had moments before. General Caldwell stood behind them, saying nothing. He noticed the cup of water set neatly in place. He noticed how Elias did not hurry away despite being driven off. No challenge. No resistance. Just standing there. And that very stillness created a feeling that could not be named, as if something remained unsaid, but could not be ignored. Elias finally turned very slowly. He did not look at the young soldiers. He did not look at the captain. He looked down at his old shoes, dusted with a thin layer of grit, then stepped aside, yielding space like a proper servant. Yet the space he left behind did not disappear. It remained there quietly, like a question that had not yet been spoken aloud. And it was precisely that space within a silence that seemed meaningless that opened the way for the first mocking remarks to emerge. Remarks that would soon turn this stillness into a public humiliation. Captain Reynolds let out a dry, brittle laugh, short, sharp, devoid of humor. He turned fully toward Elias, staring straight at him, as if he had finally found a place to unload the frustration that had been building inside him. "So you're teaching us how to read the wind now," he said, his voice higher than usual. "Go back to the kitchen." A few soldiers laughed along. Not loudly, not raucously. Just a couple of snorts, a few crooked smiles, enough to turn the remark into a public slight. The tension from moments before dissolved, but not in relief, rather in the way a crowd relaxes once it finds someone to mock. Elias remained still. He did not shrink back, nor did he lift his chin. He simply stood there, arms hanging at his sides, as though the words carried no force capable of moving him. When he spoke, his voice was small and even, carrying no trace of defiance. "The wind swirls through the canyon," he said. "It's not 10 knots. The sentence was not emphasized. It came without explanation. It was as plain as a comment about the weather. Yet that very calm made a few people turn their heads. A young soldier glanced toward the valley, then back at Elias, as if he had just heard something that did not belong here. Reynolds caught those looks. His face darkened. "You've lost it," he snapped. "We don't need the ramblings of some old kitchen hand around here." Another laugh broke out, this one louder, more unmistakable. No one objected. No one spoke up in his defense. The humiliation did not come from a single person, but from the feeling of being pushed aside, treated as though he had no right to exist in this space. Elias did not respond. He did not look at Reynolds. His gaze drifted past the men standing before him and settled on the empty distance beyond. For a very brief moment, his eyes changed. Not with sadness, not with anger. Just a deep hollow where an old memory passed through and vanished. Another valley. No laughter. No young faces. Only wind and bodies lying still, never rising again. The memory arrived as fast as a blink and disappeared just as quickly. Elias closed his eyes for a single breath, then opened them. Once again, he was an old cook standing in the middle of the range. Reynolds stepped closer as if to reassert his authority. "Go," he said. "You're in the way." Elias nodded very slightly. Not the nod of submission, but the nod of someone long accustomed to yielding space. He lifted his foot and stepped aside. Each step was slow, yet never hesitant. He did not lower his head. He did not look back. The laughter behind him did not alter his pace. Another young soldier watched him go, sensing that something was wrong, though not clearly enough to form a question. He turned away, telling himself it was none of his business. The humiliation continued to spread quietly without sound, like a thin layer of dust settling over the moment. Elias stopped at the edge of the range. He stood still. He did not intrude. He did not disappear. His presence, though dismissed, remained, and it was that presence that kept the atmosphere from returning to what it had been. The laughter faded. The remarks that followed were no longer as sharp as before. It was within that awkward silence, just as the mockery finally subsided, that another gaze appeared calm, observant, missing nothing, signaling that this humiliation was not yet the end. General Henry Caldwell did not speak right away. He had stood there through the entire firing session, listening to explanations, watching round after round, watching the confidence of young men slowly turn into irritation, then confusion. He was not the kind of commander persuaded by noise, nor was he swayed by the ego of a captain, burning with frustration over failure. What mattered to him were results, and more importantly, the true reason behind the failure. When the laughter finally died down, he began to look at the old cook the way he would study a map, before deployment, missing nothing. He noticed Elias's stance. It was not the posture of a man who had spent years behind a kitchen line, back bent from age and fatigue. His feet were planted firmly spaced, just enough to hold balance. His entire body was so still that even the passing wind failed to shift him. Caldwell noticed the eyes as well, not the eyes of someone curiously watching a military exercise, but the eyes of a man reading something unseen, the wind currents, the bullet's path, the empty spaces between gusts. And what made Caldwell pause longest of all was a calmness that did not fit the man's age. He had been shouted at, mocked, called senile. Yet his breathing remained steady, neither rushed nor shallow, showing no trace of wounded pride or fear. That calm was not natural. It was forged in days when the smallest error could be traded for a name carved in stone. Caldwell glanced toward Reynolds. The captain was struggling to preserve his authority in front of his men, to prove that he still controlled the ground beneath his boots. But Caldwell had not come to protect anyone's pride. He turned back to Elias once more, as if to be certain his eyes were not deceiving him. "Do you believe you're right?" Caldwell asked. His voice was low and direct, not a challenge, but a question meant for a man who had once stood on the edge of life and death. Elias did not answer immediately. He did not look down. He did not ask permission. He simply lifted his gaze and met the general's eyes. In that moment, the distance between them was no longer rank versus a grease-stained apron. It became the distance between two men who understood that everything in this world has a cost. "Physics doesn't care who pulls the trigger, sir." Elias set his voice as steady as before. "Neither does the bullet." Several soldiers stopped breathing on instinct. Reynolds froze as if his pride had been struck across the face. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but Caldwell raised a hand, one small motion, yet enough to silence the entire range. It was authority that required no raised voice. Reynolds tried to recover. "Sir, that's a test platform, a prototype weapon. We can't Caldwell cut him off not loudly, but coldly. I didn't ask for your opinion, Captain." He turned to the officer in charge. "Prepare the position." Then he looked directly at Elias, neither dismissive nor flattering. "Let him try." For a single second, the air seemed to freeze. Young soldiers looked at one another, searching for any sign that this was a joke. They found none. One man swallowed hard. Another tightened his grip on his rifle as if afraid the order of things had just been overturned. Reynolds stood rigid, his face flushed red at being stripped of authority in front of his subordinates. Elias, however, did not change. He did not step forward like a man granted a favor. He simply stood there as if the order were obvious, as if he had been waiting for it all along without anyone knowing. He wiped his hands once on his apron, not to clean them, but to perform a familiar motion before touching something that mattered. He looked toward the distant valley for one more measured breath. Then he began to walk slowly, straight ahead, without hesitation. Behind him, the whispers faded, giving way to a different kind of silence, the silence of waiting. And as Elias approached the firing position, the entire range was forced to confront something no one wanted to believe, that the man they had just humiliated was preparing for a moment that would redefine everything. Elias lowered himself into the firing position at a pace that drew a few sighs from behind him. No one said anything outright, but impatience showed clearly in the glances cast his way. One man shook his head almost imperceptibly. Another pressed his lips together as if waiting for a failure that had already been decided. The old man set his elbows on the ground and adjusted his body inch by inch. Slow, not clumsy. Slow because nothing could be missed. The scattered whispers, half joking, half contemptuous, faded on their own when no one bothered to answer them. Elias pulled the rifle stock firmly into his shoulder. In that instant, something changed. Not loudly, not theatrically. The change happened within. The hand that had trembled ever so slightly before was now completely steady. His dry, weathered fingers neither clenched nor relaxed. They settled exactly where they belonged, familiar as a habit etched deep into bone. His breathing slowed, then thinned until no one could detect it anymore. It vanished from the shared space existing only under his absolute control. 2 mills left. 1 up. The voice that spoke was low and cold, not the voice of an old cook, but the voice of a man who had spoken those numbers in situations where error was not permitted. A young soldier instinctively glanced at the man beside him. No one laughed. No one commented. Even Reynolds stood motionless, eyes locked on every movement, as if witnessing something he no longer had the right to mock. Elias did not fire immediately. He waited. Not out of hesitation, but because he knew timing mattered more than urgency. A current of wind passed through, then shifted. He sensed the change through his own stillness. His finger rested on the trigger, touching just enough to feel the weight of the metal, no more, no less. He waited for the gap between gusts, the space only those who have measured time and lives know how to recognize. Then the shot rang out. The sound was sharp and clean, no echo, no drama. It traveled straight as it always does when everything has been calculated correctly. No one cheered. No one applauded. A few men held their breath on instinct, as if they had not yet understood what had just happened. Every gaze fixed on the distant target. Those few seconds stretched into something unfamiliar, like waiting for an answer no one was sure they wanted to hear. Then the truth revealed itself so clear it needed no explanation. The target had been pierced dead center. No drift, no edge. Precision cold enough to unsettle. Silence fell over the range, heavy, complete. Not the silence of failure, but the silence that follows when old beliefs are shattered all at once. One soldier opened his mouth, then closed it again. Another lowered his eyes to the ground, as if reassessing himself. Reynolds stood rigid, his face set, lips pressed tight, unable to find a single sentence that might preserve his dignity. Elias opened the bolt and ejected the spent casing with one smooth, practiced motion. He did not look back at the result. He did not need to. He knew where the round had gone the moment it left the barrel. He pushed himself upright as slowly as he had lowered himself. Dust clung to his knees. He brushed it away gently, as if wiping off a familiar stain. In those brief seconds, he returned to the shape of an old man slightly hunched wearing a worn, faded apron. 14 knots, he said, turning toward Reynolds. His tone was calm, neither boastful nor challenging in the slightest. The wind's stronger in the draw. No one answered. No answer was needed. Recognition did not arrive in praise or applause. It arrived in a silence everyone was forced to accept. Elias turned away as though his task were complete. He walked slowly, leaving behind a range that would never feel the same again. And in that moment of absolute silence, while every eye still lingered on the pierced target, a small detail on Elias's arm began to draw the attention of the one person alert enough to understand its true meaning. General Caldwell did not take his eyes off Elias as the old man turned as if to leave. The general's gaze stopped on the bare forearm, exposed by a hastily rolled sleeve. A scar stood out. Not large, not recent. A star-shaped scar jagged at the edges, cut deep into the flesh like a mark carved by violence and time. Caldwell halted. He had seen that scar before, not on this man's arm, but in old reports and files stamped classified and in a story whispered for years. "Did you—" Caldwell began slowly and clearly. "Were you ever in Grey Rock Valley?" In 1971. The question was not loud, but it sliced through the air like a blade. Elias stopped mid-step. His body froze within a single breath. He did not turn around. He did not deny it at once. In that moment, time seemed to pull him far away to a place where Grey Rock was not a name on a map, but a place where men had not returned. Sir Elias said, his voice rougher than before. "I don't know what you're talking about." Caldwell stepped closer. He no longer looked at Elias as a cook or as a man who had just hit a target. He looked at him as one looks at a piece of history standing before him. "There was a sniper," Caldwell said, turning to address the entire unit, his voice clear, without needing to rise, who held off an entire enemy battalion for 3 days, so our wounded could withdraw safely. A few soldiers exchanged glances. Reynolds frowned, sensing that this story did not belong to today's firing exercise. Caldwell continued without pause. He didn't request reinforcements. He didn't ask for support. He said only one thing over the radio: "Keep moving. I'm still breathing." Elias closed his eyes for the briefest moment. His hand clenched, then released. After that battle, Caldwell went on, the sniper disappeared. No body recovered. No trace found. The file was marked MYA, presumed dead. He paused for a beat. Call sign Ghost in the Valley. A wave of silence spread. The name was not unfamiliar to those who had studied the unit's history. It was a legend, a story retold as a reminder of the ultimate limit of sacrifice. Elias turned back. His eyes no longer looked toward the distant valley, but straight at Caldwell. "Stories like that," he said quietly, "are often exaggerated." Caldwell shook his head very slightly. "Not this one," he said. "My father was among those who withdrew that day." The entire range held its breath. "He survived." Caldwell continued, his voice dropping because one man stayed behind. He said that man had a star-shaped scar on his right forearm. Caldwell stepped in front of Elias. He raised his hand not to touch, only to signal. Elias hesitated for a moment, then pulled his sleeve higher. The scar was fully revealed. No explanation was needed. No further confirmation required. Caldwell straightened. Not a ceremonial stance, but the posture of one soldier facing another. "Sergeant Major Elias Morrow," he said aloud, each word landing clearly. He raised his hand in a crisp, unhesitating salute. The entire range snapped to attention by instinct. No order was given. None was needed. Young soldiers, officers, even Reynolds, all stood straight, hands, raised eyes fixed on the man they had called senile only minutes earlier. The respect came late, but once it arrived, it could not be withdrawn. Elias stood still. He did not return the salute at once. He looked down at the aligned boots before him, then looked up. "Sir," he said, his voice more tired than ever, "I laid the rifle down a long time ago." Caldwell lowered his hand, but his eyes never left Elias. "Honor," he replied, "is never laid down." The truth had been spoken. Honor had been named. But for Elias, it had never been what he sought. And just as the truth finally stood exposed, as honor was restored before the entire unit, Elias was forced to face something harder than war itself, the choice between the past and how he wished to live the rest of his life. Reynolds stepped forward a pace, his movement no longer sharp as it had been when he gave orders. His shoulders lowered, his eyes no longer searched for approval from superiors or admiration from subordinates. He stopped in front of Elias, straightened himself, then bowed his head. Not a token gesture, a bow low enough for everyone to see. "Sergeant Major." "I was wrong." Reynolds said, his voice rough. "I saw the rank before I saw the man." Elias looked at him for a long moment. No reproach, no satisfaction. In his eyes, there was only the weariness of someone who had lived through too many days for an apology that arrived too late. He shook his head slightly, very gently, as if brushing aside something that no longer mattered. "I like cooking," Elias said. "It's quieter there." The answer caught a few people off guard. No one expected a man just addressed with honor to say something so simple. No medals, no exploits. Just the kitchen, the smell of food, the repetitive work that does not demand life and death decisions. Elias turned to look at the young soldiers standing at attention before him. They were no longer the ones who had laughed minutes earlier. They were faces, listening, truly listening. "Don't learn to shoot well," he said slowly. "Learn when you don't need to shoot." No one laughed. No whispers followed. The words did not sound like a lecture. They sounded like a warning passed down by someone who had already paid the price. A young soldier swallowed hard, tightened his grip on the sling across his chest, then loosened it. Another lowered his eyes to his boots, as if reassessing the path he had chosen. Reynolds remained still, offering no interruption, no further defense. He understood that this lesson was not meant only for the younger soldiers. It was meant for him as well. He had spent years climbing to this position, through discipline and achievement, yet no one had ever told him that maturity is not measured by how often you pull the trigger, but by how often you restrain yourself. General Caldwell watched without intervening. He knew when to give orders and when to let silence do the work instead. The soldiers standing before Elias were caught in a rare moment where strength did not come from authority or skill, but from truth spoken without armor. Elias reached up and pulled his sleeve back down, covering the scar that had brought the entire range to attention. He did not want it to remain the center. To him, that scar was only a marker for those who were no longer standing here to be saluted. "You all have many years ahead of you," he continued, his voice lower now. "Don't let those years be decided by a single moment of anger." A young soldier nodded slightly, not daring to speak. Another took a deep breath as if recognizing something about himself. Faces that had once been tense now settled into a different kind of seriousness, deeper, quieter, without display. Reynolds lifted his head. He said nothing more. The apology had been given. The lesson received. What remained was his responsibility to the soldiers he would lead from this day forward. Elias stepped back, yielding the space. He no longer stood at the center. He did not need to. What needed to be said had been said. What needed to be heard had been heard. No one looked at him as a legend anymore. They looked at him as a standard. And that standard carried more weight than any title. From that moment on, when the lesson had been given and forgiveness accepted, something new began to take shape. Quietly, without declaration, yet powerful enough to change how this place would function from the very next day. Elias did not return to the battlefield. He declined every invitation framed as honor or ceremony. He remained exactly where he was, on the familiar training range where the wind is always changing, and people must learn how to listen. He wore no rank, no name tag, no insignia. He carried only the knowledge earned through years in which every mistake carried a price. His presence required no announcement. Everyone knew when he was there and when it was time to be silent and listen. A new training manual was introduced. It was not long, not embellished, just a few pages written neatly and precisely. At the top of the first page was a simple line, "Wind Doctrine Morrow Method." No photograph of the author, no biography. Only principles drawn from reality, from waiting for the wind to change from life and death decisions that could never be undone. Young officers read it differently, not because it was new, but because they knew the man who wrote it had survived before those principles ever had a name. The water cart still creaked every morning. The sound never disappeared. It became part of the rhythm of the place. Elias still pushed it across the range, setting cups of water down as he always had. But the way people looked at him had changed. No one called him a cook anymore. No one ordered him to leave. Young soldiers stood a little straighter when he passed, not out of fear, but out of respect. They understood that some people do not need to stand before a formation to teach what matters most. From time to time, Elias stopped at the edge of the range and watched the wind. He did not lecture. He spoke only when asked. "Don't look at the flag," he would say. "Watch the dust." Those words were remembered not because they were clever, but because they were true, and because the man who spoke them had never used his knowledge to boast. Reynolds changed the way he trained his men. He never spoke about it, but the sessions that followed were longer, quieter. Fewer commands, more questions. Soldiers were taught how to hold back, not just how to hit their mark. Caldwell stopped by from time to time without notice. He did not seek Elias out to exchange salutes. He simply observed, and each time he gave a slight nod, as if confirming that the decision made that day had been the right one. Elias did not stay after training hours. He returned to the kitchen. He cooked. He washed pots. He wiped tables. The work was repetitive, simple, free from decisions whose consequences could last a lifetime. To him, it was a form of peace. Young soldiers would occasionally stop by. They did not say much. They ate, then nodded. Elias nodded back. No thanks were needed. Time passed. New classes arrived and moved on. The manual remained. The method endured. No one mentioned the name Ghost in the Valley during lessons. There was no need. What mattered more were the things left behind by that name: patience, humility, and the ability to know when to stop. There would always be people who never knew who Elias was, and he did not need them to know. His legacy did not live in stories retold, but in decisions made at the right moment by people he would never meet, in shots that were never fired, in lives preserved because someone remembered the wind, remembered the empty space, and remembered the words of an old man who once stood at the edge of a training range. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please share this video and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes,